Hello, my name is Dana Koletar, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar sponsored by Healthcare for All Minnesota. Could we have the next slide, please? Today's topic is Democracy in the Balance, How and Why to Vote in 2020. Our presenters are Ken Engelhart, who is a board member of Healthcare for All Minnesota, and Ann Jones, who is the vice chair of Healthcare for All Minnesota. So our organization is dedicated to promoting comprehensive, affordable, high-quality health care for every Minnesotan through advocacy, education, and community organizing. We want healthcare for people, not for profit. We want to educate and engage on healthcare financing reform, organize and build a base of support, and work with legislators to pass and implement reform. So our agenda for today, Ken Engelhart will talk about on the future of the Republic and why do we vote. Ann Jones will give us a brief history of suffrage in the US. Ken will return to talk about details on voting and key dates for 2020. We will talk about being a healthcare voter, being an advocate, and then repeat our key dates and steps. So we're going to start with Ken. So Ken, if you want to come on with your video and audio.
Hi everyone, welcome to the noon lunch and learn on voting. The first slide here shows the We the People Constitution, and Benjamin Franklin, when he was exiting the Constitutional Convention in 1787, was approached by a group of citizens who were eager to learn what sort of government the delegates had created. And Franklin's answer was, a republic, if you can keep it. In just a few short weeks, we will know what type of government we have. We will know if we have a government that once again adheres to ethics and the rule of law, where truth is again sacred, and where our government imparts a feeling of pride in its citizens. I am greatly concerned about our republic and whether we can keep it. Corruption is rampant, with numerous officials and aides of the current administration having pled guilty or having been tried and found guilty and convicted of various crimes. I am concerned about the functioning of the separation of powers and the maintenance of independent, co-equal branches of government, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive branches. I am alarmed about the future of our country when I hear repeatedly that the press is the enemy of the people, which is a statement that is used by dictators and is an attack on our First Amendment. We are living in perilous times. We all need to be aware of that. Our republic is at risk. This is why we are presenting this webinar on why and how you can vote. So to start, a brief spin through history on why it is important to vote and what people have done to achieve the right to vote for us as citizens of the United States. So the first slide shows King George III. This King George was not very popular among the colonists. They didn't appreciate the tyranny he wielded over the colonists. And in the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, they stated that the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. So the colonists did not really appreciate being ruled by a king and having no voice. The Declaration further went on to say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That last part is extremely important. From the consent of the government, we, the people, determine our leadership by voting. This picture is a picture of a woman voting in California and holding her child. I think this little kiddo kind of looks like Winston Churchill, and he's looking at you, and he's asking if you voted yet. Next slide, please. So, our First Amendment in the Bill of Rights states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This picture that you see here is an exact opposite of what the intent of the First Amendment is to be. It is a picture of Lafayette Square and peaceful protesters being tear gassed. NPR reported on June 1st, 2020, that the plaza between St. John's Church and Lafayette Park was full of people non-violently protesting police brutality late Monday afternoon, when U.S. Park Police and National Guard troops, with the use of tear gas, suddenly started pushing them away for no apparent reason. Next slide, please. Why vote? On D-Day, June 6, 1944, American troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. On the cliffs above the beaches were German Nazi troops who were firing upon the Allies as they landed on the beaches of Normandy. And American troops in this picture are shown helping their injured comrades after their landing craft was fired upon by these Nazis. And although the true number of casualties on D-Day will never be known, it is estimated to be about 10,000. Overall, in World War II, there were 291,000 combat deaths. And when you factor in deaths by disease and accident, other causes such as murder and suicide, the overall death rate in World War II was 405,000 deaths. In that war, 670,000 US troops were wounded. So why did these soldiers risk their lives, risk their bodies to being maimed? Why did they do this? Look at the faces of these troops. I think if you ask them, they would tell you that we're fighting for democracy and against fascist authoritarianism. And they equated democracy to freedom and the right to vote. They sacrificed their lives and their bodies so that we had the right to vote in the United States of America. Next slide, please. This slide is a picture of my most recent hero that I've added to my list of heroes. It's a picture of Alice Paul. She was one tough lady and was a suffragette in the women's suffrage movement. Now, Anne is going to talk more extensively about the women's suffrage movement, and we're celebrating 100 years of women obtaining the right to vote. But the women's suffrage movement was a decades-long fight to win the right to vote for women in the United States. It took activists and reformers nearly 100 years to win that right, and the campaign was not easy. It's just hard to imagine in this day and age that women at one time, half of the United States population, did not have the right to vote. Alice Paul, in her quote pictured here, stated, "I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated, but to me, there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality." Next. And just one other comment about Alice Paul. The fight was very difficult for her. She was imprisoned, she was beaten, she was force-fed with a feeding tube, a crude concoction of eggs and milk while in prison and doing a starvation protest. So she was one tenacious, tough lady who endured a lot for women to obtain the right to vote. Next slide, please. This slide is a picture of the late John Lewis leading a march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on March 7th, 1965. And the purpose of that march was to go from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, a 52-mile march. And they were going to deliver a message of freedom to segregationist Governor George C. Wallace, who had vowed segregation forever. Well, what happened on March 7th is Bloody Sunday. John Lewis was beaten. He was clubbed over the head twice, suffered a skull fracture when trying to lead this march, which was disrupted by Alabama troopers who brutally attacked the protesters on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. As I mentioned, it was known as Bloody Sunday, and the incident precipitated the passage of the Voting Rights Act by President Johnson. Now, that march actually did go through on March 21st, 1965, 2 weeks later after the first attempt. So recently, we were saddened to learn of the death of the Honorable Representative John Lewis. He crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge for the last time in a horse-drawn hearse on July 26, 2020. And when the hearse approached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the crowd shouted out, "Thank you, John Lewis," and "Good trouble," which was the phrase he used to describe his tangles with white authorities during the civil rights movement. So people were beaten, suffered skull fractures to obtain the right to vote, the African-American right to vote. So below the picture of John Lewis is a picture of President Lyndon Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law on August 6th, 1965. And Anne, I think this is where you continue with the history.
Well, soon after we decided to do this program on voting in the 2020 election cycle, I realized that 2020 is the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. If it weren't for COVID-19, women's groups would have been holding great celebrations, reminding us of this achievement and rededicating ourselves to progress on women's rights and human rights. While this was a great achievement, thanks to decades of struggle by hundreds of thousands of heroic women, it is, and men who supported them in some cases, it is only a part of the story on this most fundamental means of participating in representative democracy. And until just a few years ago, my own understanding of the women's suffrage movement consisted mostly of images like this one: women marching for votes for women, wearing white, big hats and sashes. I hope you can see my sash and my Votes for Women button. Carrying flags and banners. I thought somehow that when women finally started pushing, the movement just grew, and pretty soon women were given the right to vote. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. By the mid-19th century, the push for women's suffrage was actually gaining ground in countries around the world. Here in the US in 1848, two women, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, hosted the Seneca Falls Convention. It was the first women's rights convention in the country. This convention published a document that they called the Declaration of Sentiments, based on the Declaration of Independence, that called for voting rights for women and other reforms. However, it would be 72 years of struggle and sacrifice and organizing for change. And all of this before social media and the internet, before women earned the right to vote. During that time in our history, of course, the movement was interrupted by cataclysmic changes: a terrible civil war, the abolition of slavery, the granting of the vote to freed slaves, but males only at that time. Women were asked to wait. Massive shifts in population and immigration, a westward expansion, the Industrial Revolution, economic changes, and other social movements, including temperance, along with periods of great disappointment and division amongst leaders for the quest for women's suffrage. This photo shows members of the National Women's Party picketing outside the White House in 1917 in an attempt to bring attention to the push for women's suffrage to the public, as well as to try to gain support from then President Wilson, who had sent American soldiers to Europe during World War I to fight for democracy. One of the banners reads, "We, the women of America, tell you that America is not a democracy." Contrary to what we think today, picketing outside the White House was not at that time a common practice, certainly not for women. These women picketed 6 days a week in all kinds of weather for months. President Wilson did notice, but again asked the women to wait. Hence the banner saying, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" So over the months, these women endured harassment, violence, and arrest. It wasn't until I saw a movie called Iron-Jawed Angels that I learned the true extent of the sacrifices that so many women made to earn the right to vote for me. This incredibly powerful movie showed women being arrested, beaten, and abused, force-fed when they went on a hunger strike after months of being held in jail for exercising their rights under the First Amendment, peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. I will just comment that it is shocking that we learn so little about this long struggle for women's suffrage in our American history classes, and say that I resolved that I will never, ever again take the right to vote for granted. This massive statue, carved by Adelaide Johnson 6 months after the 19th Amendment passed on July 18, 1920, memorializes prominent women suffragists Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony. All three women were leaders of the long struggle, starting back in the 1800s. None lived long enough to see their dream of women's suffrage realized. The day after this statue was unveiled, Congress ordered it moved out of sight, where it remained for 75 years until 1997, when women's groups celebrating the 75th anniversary of the 19th Amendment managed to get it moved into the Hall of Statues in the Capitol in Washington, D.C. If you go to see it today, you will note that the busts of these three women arise from a block of uncut marble, and there is an unfinished pillar of marble behind Susan B. Anthony. This is meant to suggest that the fight for feminism is also unfinished. Notably, the Equal Rights Amendment, which still has not been ratified. Of course, now in recognition of gender justice, the wording of the Equal Rights Amendment needs to be updated. So the struggle continues. Briefly, beyond the history of the struggle for women's suffrage, this list of actions explains that this history has been long over the period of time where we in this country who think of ourselves as a democracy. But it is a reminder of the struggle to make the promise of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution real for all groups in our society. Going back to the 1700s, only white men with property were allowed to vote. By about 1860, although the franchise had been extended to most white men with or without property. Amendment 13 abolished slavery on January 31st, 1865. Amendment 14 extended citizenship to those born or naturalized in this country. And Section 2 extended the right to vote to all males who had of age 21 or older. Amendment 15 prohibited denial based on race, passed in 1870. And then finally, August 18th, 1920, prohibited denial based on sex. The Electoral College, however, precludes direct election of the president. Two important notes. This history is still incomplete because the right to vote for Native Americans is often overlooked and complicated by the centuries-long struggle for full citizenship and legal protections of voting rights. And because of the Electoral College, a relic of the thinking of the framers in 1787, it is a fundamentally undemocratic method of determining who will be placed in the only elected office in the country accountable to all of us. African American women fought hard for the right to vote, but mostly were not welcomed by white women as part of the movement, both because of racism lingering at that time and because of a fear that their presence would harm the chances for success in gaining suffrage for women and eventually all women. So any mention of women's suffrage should be followed immediately with the admission that in 1920, white women earned the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment. It would be another 40 plus years before all women could vote. And the struggle for civil rights and voting rights for Blacks found an important leader in Martin Luther King and many others, but resulted in the passage of the 24th Amendment in 1964, clarifying and prohibiting the use of poll taxes and other meaningless barriers for voting. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which you heard about from Ken, which directed the Attorney General of the United States to enforce the right to vote, which had already supposedly been gained for African Americans. While the 14th and 15th Amendments extended the right to vote to Black males following the Civil War, but the actual exercise of the franchise was deliberately subverted for another 100 years by numerous barriers, including those poll taxes, literacy tests, outright refusal to allow Blacks to register and exercise their right to vote. Civil rights icon John Lewis, who we just lost this past summer, great-grandson of a slave, son of a sharecropper, and raised in the Deep South, himself became painfully aware of the lot of Blacks living in rural Georgia when, as a child, he went to the library in his small town and just tried to get a library card and was denied based on color. At age 17, he joined other young African Americans in peaceful nonviolent protests, such as the simple act of sitting at a lunch counter for whites only, and endured abuse and violence in trying to desegregate schools and public spaces. He was one of the youngest members of the leaders of this movement that conducted this march across that bridge and the March on Washington. So read more about it in this new book by John Meacham. I well remember John Lewis saying so many times, if you see something that's not fair, that's not right, that's not just, you have to stand up, you have to speak up. And the right to vote is critical, almost sacred. He went on to run for office, of course, and served as a member of Congress in the state of Georgia for many years. And he remains an inspiration to all of us to get into trouble for what we believe. Good trouble. Today, many believe that the right to vote and the promise of free and fair elections is under threat. Voting procedures vary by state. Voter suppression seems to be on the rise, related to a perceived benefit to one political party over the other. Voter ID laws, list purges that seem to target certain groups, restricting polling places, weakening of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, in particular, removing Section 5. And we have a bill in the House right now of the Congress to restore Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. It, of course, cannot get a hearing or votes in the Senate. Voting rights for persons who've been kind of on the wrong side of the criminal justice system and need those voting rights restored. Restricting citizenship for immigrants is widely viewed as a way of keeping certain groups out of the process of voting. And then outright voter intimidation, the recent attempts to dismantle our postal service to subvert the practice of mail-in voting, and then questioning mail-in ballots as valid, even though many states and parts of our state have been using mail-in ballots only for many, many years. To learn more about it, this is just a small sample of the vast amount of material on voting and the fight for the ballot in America. We are widely regarded as the oldest and longest surviving democracy, although it would be a good civics lesson for everyone listening today to look up the difference between a republic and a democracy. Because of the Electoral College, we do not directly elect the president, as I said. A national popular vote might fix that. Of great concern, and to Ken's remarks earlier, I think we should realize that according to the World Economic Forum, we no longer rank in the top 10 list of the world's strongest democracies. We are now considered a flawed democracy, primarily as a result of low public confidence in the government. And this was true even prior to the election of the current president. In my view, we are experiencing a stress test on American democracy, and we have to turn it around. Again, this is a list of some of the more well-known nonprofit issues organizations dedicated to promoting and preserving the right to vote in our representative democracy. And I'll turn this back over to Ken.
So Anne, I will need the slide on socialism first, please. There we go. Thank you. Before I tell you how to vote in Minnesota, I'd really like to discuss two words. One is socialism, and the other one is fascism. Now, socialism is a word that's often dredged up when there is a proposal to benefit millions of people in the lower economic classes and in the vanishing middle class. And the intent of raising the word socialism is to strike fear into people and make them question whether the proposal should pass. But let's first look at the definition of socialism. I think many of the people who fear the word socialism really don't know what the word means. So Merriam-Webster's dictionary states that socialism is any of various economic and political theories advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. 2B states it is a system or condition of society in which the means of production are owned and controlled by the state. Well, I haven't heard any candidate from any major party advocating for the government control of businesses, the ownership of businesses and their employees, the ownership of hospitals and clinics and their employees. And all we have really heard about is a financing mechanism of Medicare for All, which will save hundreds of millions of dollars every year. It isn't a proposal to take ownership of all the hospitals and clinics in this country or the employees that work there. It's a finance mechanism designed to eliminate millions of dollars each year in administrative waste and make payment for medical care much more efficient. So when you hear the word socialism, please understand what it means. It means that the government owns and controls the means of production, and nobody in any major party is advocating for that. Next slide, please. The second word I'd like to talk about is fascism. I think we've seen a definite drift toward fascism in recent years. This 12 warning sign slide comes from an author named Britt in a publication called Free Inquiry, published in the spring of 2003. Now, as I go through this list of 12 warning signs, I think that if anyone who has been paying attention to the news at all thinks about them, they'll be familiar terms to you. So, warning signs of fascism. The first, powerful and continuing nationalism. We've heard a lot about nationalism in recent years. Number two, disdain for human rights. What we're talking about here is children separated from their families, immigrant children separated from their families, put in cages and deprived of basic health needs such as soap and toothpaste. Third, Identification of enemies as a unifying cause. How many enemies have we heard? How many classes of people have we heard about as being enemies? Number 4, rampant sexism. Think about all of the ugly terms addressed toward women and the names they've been called. Number 5, controlled mass media. We've heard about the press being the enemy of the people, a term that dictators use, and a direct assault on the First Amendment. Number 6, obsession with national security. Number 7, something we've definitely seen, religion and government intertwined. Number 8, corporate power protected. Number 9, labor power suppressed. Number 10, disdain for the intellectual and the arts. And I should also add, disdain for science, which is why we're in the predicament we are in now with COVID-19. Number 11, obsession with crime and punishment. Think of the recent terms law and order. And number 12, rampant cronyism and corruption. According to USA Today, August 20th, 2020, this current administration has 7 former advisors who served in the White House or worked on the campaign that have been involved in criminal prosecutions. The optimistic slide, please, Ann. But I am optimistic that we can reverse the dangerous course that we have experienced over the past few years. I believe that Minnesotans and millions of our fellow Americans remain capable of thinking for themselves, that they seek the truth, and that they desire to make decisions based on truthful facts and honest evidence. Please commit to voting as soon as possible to protect and strengthen our shared democracy, and allow me at this time to review with you how you can vote in Minnesota. So this slide that's currently being shown is from the Minnesota Secretary of State. I put mnvotes.org in red and in the biggest font I could find to show you the importance of that website. It is the Secretary of State's website, and basically it is the authoritative source about how to vote in Minnesota. So if you have any questions at all about how to vote in Minnesota, please use mnvotes.org as your reference and your resource. The phone number for the Secretary of State's office is listed below, 877-600-8683. Next slide, please. So if you go to mnvotes.org, there are some key things that you'll note there. One is that you can verify that you're registered to vote. If not, you can register online to vote. You can find voting dates, locations, and hours. You'll learn what you can bring on, what you should bring on registration day, or election day rather, to register. So the documents you'll need to register to vote are listed on mnvotes.org. You'll find tips for new voters, and you'll find out what are the rights as Minnesotans we have for voting. For example, we can't be docked for pay or be told we can't have time off from work to vote. Next slide, please. So other things on mnvotes.org, it talks about voting early in person, which actually started on September 18th, and it includes early voting locations and hours. mnvotes.org also includes voting early by mail. You can apply online for your ballot. You can track the status of your ballot, and you can learn voting by mail deadlines. I voted in the primary for our U.S. representative by mail, and I was able to go to mnvotes.org and learn that my ballot was received, and it was stated that it would be counted. So you can have assurance in tracking your ballot that your vote will be counted. Also, mnvotes.org has voting fact sheets, a sample ballot that you can review, your precinct number if you want to get the details on that. And also for those that are in the military or living abroad, there's information about how to vote in those circumstances. You can apply online or download a paper application for a ballot, and the critical dates to that pertain to your ballot if you're in the military or living abroad. Next slide, please. So, how can you vote this year in a time of pandemic? Well, first, you can vote early by mail from home. Second, you can vote early in person. And third, you can vote on election day. Next slide, please. So voting early by mail. You can go to mnvotes.org, apply for a ballot that will be mailed to you, but the U.S. Postal Service is advocating that you apply before October 19th because of the delays in the mail that we've seen recently. Now, what I would recommend is that after you apply for a ballot by mail, go to mnvotes.org and take a look at the sample ballot that you'll find there so you're familiar with the issues. And that will save you time while you're waiting for your ballot to arrive in the mail. And then that will enable you to complete that ballot and get it in the mail as soon as possible. I can't emphasize enough, early voting this year is so critically important. Whether you do it by mail or what I would absolutely recommend for your consideration, going and voting early in person, which I did a couple weeks ago. To continue on with voting early by mail, please carefully follow the instructions that are included with your ballot and mail that ballot in as soon as possible. There are signatures needed in certain places, like on an envelope when you mail it back in. So please carefully follow the instructions to make sure your ballot is valid and will be counted. Now, you have to have your envelope by mail-in ballot postmarked on or before Election Day, which is November 3rd, 2020. I would highly discourage you from waiting that long to vote because of the delays in the mail. Early is the key here in this year's election. You can take that absentee ballot that you receive in the mail and actually drop it off in person to the election office that sent your ballot to you no later than 3 p.m. on election day. So you do have the choice of taking that ballot that you receive in the mail, and instead of sending it back by mail, you can go and drop it off in person to the election office that sent the ballot to you. You may not drop off your ballot at the polling place on election day, so please don't waste your time and effort doing that. Absentee mail-in ballots are not allowed at polling places on election day. You can also drop off up to 3 ballots from other vote. Yes, you may drop off ballots from up to 3 other voters. You have to have your ID with name and signature, however, to drop off those ballots for up to 3 other voters. Next slide, please. So the second way of voting is voting in person. And this is the way I would highly recommend to everyone considering, and I recommend that you do it tomorrow if you can, or Friday if you have to, but get it done as soon as possible. Voting early in person started September 18th. You can find voting locations at mnvotes.org. Generally, voting early in person happens at your county election office, but it's worth checking with your city clerk's office for possible closer locations than the county election office, so that you can maybe vote at a closer location based upon what the city clerk tells you. Vote as soon as possible. The last date to vote early in person is Monday, November 2nd, 2020, which is the day before the election. I was very confident when I voted early in person because I got my ballot, and when I turned it in, there's a clerk waiting to take the ballot and make sure everything is done properly, including your signature on it. So I left voting early in person very confident and assured that my ballot was valid and would be counted. So the third way of voting, of course, is the traditional method, is voting on election day, which is Tuesday, November 3rd. The polls are open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m., and you can find voting locations at mnvotes.org. Next slide, please. So important dates. Again, the earlier you vote, the better. We already have had ballots sent out in the mail since September 18th. Also, since September 18th, we've been able to vote early in person. Now, you can go vote early in person and register there at the same time as long as you bring proof of residence. And again, what you need for proof of residence is listed on mnvotes.org. October 13th, this is the last day that the post office and the League of Women Voters, I'm sorry, this is the last day that the League of Women Voters states that you can register online or by mail to vote. But don't let that discourage you. If we're past October 13th, you can still register to vote at the polls on election day. Again, go to mnvotes.org and check and see what documents you need to bring to register at the polls if you're not registered yet. November 2nd is the last date to vote early in person. November 3rd, election day, you can register at the polls in person with proper proof of residence. Now on November 3rd, absentee ballots by mail must be postmarked by that day, by election day, but they will be counted until November 10th, 2020, 1 week after the election. Next slide, please. I'm just going to show you a few pictures of voting, historical voting in the United States. This first picture is a group of ladies from the CIO, which is the Congress of Industrial Organizations, at a meeting in 1952, and they're holding a sign that is so true. You have not fulfilled every duty to yourself and your family unless you vote in all elections. Let's think about that a little bit. We've had 100 years now of the women having the right to vote that didn't exist at one time in our country. We have had the right for African Americans to vote actually since the 15th Amendment in 1870, but because that was circumvented in so many ways, we had to have the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed. And now African Americans have the right to vote, where at one time they didn't have that right. So what happens with your vote endures for generations to come. Next slide, please. Now, this slide is for people who say they don't have the time to vote. This is a slide of a diver in San Francisco, California, voting in 1974. He's from Podesta Divers. So he took time off from work to go to the polls in his diving suit to vote. So just kind of an interesting historical voting picture for you. Next slide, please. And this one is just fantastic. This just recently appeared. I saw this in the Washington Post yesterday. This is a picture, I guess, of another hero I'm going to add to the list, Bee Lumpkin. She's 102 years old. She's a Chicago Teachers Union retiree, and she is casting her vote this year by mail. And if Bee can do it, anyone can do it. Vote, as the Chicago Teachers Union states. So the Washington Post states that even behind the hazmat-style hood that partially covered her face, Beatrice Lumpkin was grinning. And in a photo shared by the Chicago Teachers Union last week, the 102-year-old is gripping her ballot with gloved hands, wearing personal protective gear she said was designed by her grandson, and she voted by mail in what she calls the most important election of my life. She has voted every year since 1940, when she voted for FDR to be president. And she's already received confirmation that her ballot was received, and she has the statement in the Washington Post article that voting is not just because we're in the midst of a pandemic, because she believes that democracy is on the line. And that's why she feels that this election is the most important one of her 102-year-old life. Next slide, please. Finally, I'd like to conclude with some quotes by people about the importance of voting. Abraham Lincoln stated that the ballot is stronger than the bullet. Next, please. Our Attorney General, Keith Ellison, stated that not voting is not a protest, it is a surrender. Next slide, please. George Jean Nathan stated that bad officials are elected by good citizens who do not vote. Next slide, please. Barack Obama stated that there is no such thing as a vote that doesn't matter. And next, please. This one probably is my favorite quote by George Carlin. If you don't vote, you lose the right to complain. And Anne, I think at this point, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ken. Well, we all care about a number of issues when we vote, but as Healthcare for All Minnesota, we hope that you will consider healthcare payment reform as you choose your candidates, and then join us in advocating for real change. Since we are lifting up some heroes of voting rights and the progressive movement, I will share this quote by Martin Luther King, written in his letter from the Birmingham jail on April 16, 1963. You know, I can make the economic case for healthcare payment reform, and we have to, but in the end, this is a social justice issue that crosses racial, economic, gender, and political lines, and we are all in this together. We know that it's going to take legislation to get the change that we need. And this is an overview quickly of the dual track toward passing something in the state of Minnesota or at the federal level. Fixing how we pay for healthcare will require legislation, which makes the participation in the political process critical for success. This legislation will require building significant political will for reform. And while leaders can certainly influence public opinion, this kind of change needs a lot of grassroots support and pressure from the public. We do ask for your contact information if we don't already have it, and I may repeat this again, and please open anything you see that the sender is Healthcare for All Minnesota. We don't flood your inbox, but we do send information out maybe a couple times a month or a little bit more often. Please open the information up that you get and look for ways to participate and share events like the one that we're doing today. Be an activist, even if that means picking only 2 or 3 things that you will do. I do believe that leaders, candidates and office holders who champion this cause and run on change will make a difference. Many candidates stay away from, and office holders too, from specific proposals and solutions. So how do I figure out where my candidates stand on my issues, and especially what about healthcare? Well, we are a nonpartisan issues organization, so we don't at this time endorse individual candidates. We suggest that you go to the candidate's website, and you'll notice that candidates often stay away from specific proposals and solutions and opt for words like universal coverage, lowering drug prices, affordable health care, improving access, and the like. These are all great goals, and it's our job to help turn these goals into support for a single payer Medicare for all style payment system. I would caution that reliance on more taxpayer subsidies for commercial health insurance coverage or more direct subsidies to commercial health insurance companies in the hopes of lowering premiums, or the belief that a public option or some sort of publicly run insurance plan in addition to private plans will ever get us to universal coverage or save money. These are flawed proposals, and they will cost more money and will fail. That doesn't mean that we don't try to support candidates who genuinely want solutions to the problems of cost, quality, and access to healthcare. It just means that we have more work to do to advocate for real healthcare payment reform once we have majorities in both chambers and can get hearings and debate on the bills that we support. As members of the public, it's up to us to let candidates and office holders know that we support real reform, help build that political will, and help support them in this effort. Well, election 2020 is on us. This election cycle looks a little bit different. The stakes are very high, and we are seeing fewer in-person events and doing less face-to-face voter contacts this time around. So what can we do? We can make phone calls, do mailings, put up lawn signs to create more interest and visibility for candidates you support, and of course, encouraging vote by mail. There are direct actions. While door-to-door campaigning is not happening much this year, you can do sign holding, banners, postcards to voters. Recently, a woman in my district organized sign holding over the 35W freeway. We were standing on 46th Avenue. We had tons of visibility and lots of people sounding their horns and waving and giving us the thumbs up. This is me personally supporting the candidate I care about, of course. So maybe to door knocking, not very likely. Maybe lit drops might happen yet toward the end of this campaign cycle. And of course, no voter contact without proper public health precautions in place. Elections matter. We have only to look at the 2016 presidential election and then to our Attorney General race here in 2018 to pause and think about what if either of those had turned out differently, or changing the majority parties in the state house and the Congress in 2018 certainly made a difference. Working on campaigns can be a great opportunity to build relationships with candidates and office holders, and to position yourself as an honest broker for information on health policy and fixing how we pay for health care. I can guarantee you that when I run into candidates and office holders at the Capitol and lobbying on issues I care about, if I have participated in that legislator's race, they remember me. So please consider getting involved in the electoral process, even beyond voting. Find ways to help with campaigns this cycle, and then be a healthcare voter. So again, we're a nonpartisan issues organization, but we have to have a legislature and a Congress who are with us on fixing how we pay for healthcare if we ever hope to be successful. And then once you get people in who you believe are with you on an issue, be an advocate. Even when we get a legislature that is friendly to health and human services, we will have to push really hard for change. We have in real time, we've had over 210,000 deaths due to COVID-19, with hundreds of thousands more testing positive. Many of them are sick with a deadly virus that traveled around the world in a matter of months, and a healthcare system that was unprepared to handle it. Add that to millions of people unemployed, half of whom had insurance tied to their jobs, and businesses struggling with months of reduced or no activity. It ought to be obvious that it's time to separate healthcare coverage from employment. I can't entirely explain the disconnect between the need for change and the lack of intensity of public pressure for changing how we pay for healthcare, but we have all the information we need. We have the stories, we understand the policy, we have legislation that's ready to go. We know what will work to fix this problem. The power of the status quo is very strong. Polls consistently tell us that this is a top issue for voters, and it's up to us to translate that into political will and action. So this is our work, continuing to educate the public and organizing the numbers we will need to push for change. To be successful, we have to create more of us. We ask for your contact information so that we can stay in touch with you, and just giving you here a little list of activities for volunteers that will help us build this movement. Organizing and advocating for change involves adding to our numbers of supporters and allied organizations, building relationships with candidates and office holders, and creating the political will for change. So literally making that change inevitable and broadly accepted by the public. We are not alone. These are just some of the national organizations working hard on healthcare payment reform. And we continue to build relationships with organizations here in Minnesota with a shared interest in that reform, including organizations representing the interests of small businesses and persons living in rural Minnesota. Every advocacy organization comes up with a list of actions for people who want to help move an issue. This is what we used to hand out on paper, but now I'll just show you online: a commitment to act and a list of ways that you as an individual can take some action to contribute to the whole. Just pick 2 or 3 things that you will do. Talk to friends, family, and neighbors. Anything that suggests in-person action on a list like this should, of course, be virtual at this time or done very safely. These references are mostly available online and on websites and are a wealth of information. So even if you've never pictured yourself becoming an expert on health policy, the more you know, the more confidence you will have in holding conversations with others, including voters, and in advocating legislation to fix how we pay for healthcare in Minnesota and in the country as a whole. We'll be sending slides out to you in the post-event email so you don't have to memorize any of this or take notes. And if you've ever wanted to know how to influence what happens at the Capitol, these are notes from a presentation by my representative, Jim Dabney, and includes lots of ways to be effective in advocating any issue of concern to you. Also gives you a realistic understanding of how the political process works. And we'll probably go into this again, more on this when we vote in that majority in both chambers who are with us on progressive issues, and we're actually talking about lobbying for a bill. If anybody has questions, you could, for us at this time, you could put them in the chat and we could possibly take time to answer some of those.
Yes, and there was one question. I don't know if you or Ken would like to answer this. It says, can you register to vote at the early voting sites after October 13th?
My understanding of the intent of the state of Minnesota is that if you go to vote in person up until the time of election day and you bring the proper documents to register, you can register when you go in person. So if you go to the early voting locations and you're not registered to vote, I think you can register there if you bring the proper document. I would encourage you to go to mnvotes.org, however, and verify that. Check how to register at mnvotes.org, and also early voting in person at mnvotes.org. But I think if you go in person all the way up until election day and you bring the proper documents, you're able to register to vote at that in-person voting site.
All right, thank you, Ken. I think I can answer this one. It says, can you repeat the name of your Facebook page? If you go into Facebook and you just search for Healthcare for All Minnesota, Minnesota spelled out, you should be able to find our page that way. Okay, if there's any more questions, please put them in and maybe we can advance the slides to where we need to be. Okay, so we've just got the contact information for our organization, for Ken and for Ann. And again, that will be sent out in the post-webinar email in 2 days that will go out. And is there another slide after that? Okay. So thank you for attending. I did want to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. It will be uploaded to our YouTube channel where you can watch it or share it with others, as well as all our other webinars also are published on our YouTube channel. And again, we encourage you to either watch them or share them with others. We feel we've been able to reach a lot of people with our webinars, so we appreciate your help with that as well. So with that, I think we are done for today. Thank you, Ken and Anne. That was a great presentation.